I remember when I was in school, we had to write our papers and hand them in double spaced so our teachers could write their comments in between the lines and have plenty of space to do so. These days, the line spacing requirements may be different, especially if we're supposed to use things like MLA or APA formatting. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, those are just a couple of the style guidelines that a lot of high schools and colleges and even technical documents follow. We certainly have very specific guidelines for things like legal documents and even in publishing. But regardless of what those requirements are, line spacing is something that we need to talk about. Line spacing denotes how much space is between each line of text in the paragraph. Generally, the line spacing is going to be consistent throughout an entire document, but in some cases, in some special circumstances, that may not be true, and just one or two paragraphs may be spaced differently. So while it's usually applied to an entire document, it's important for us to remember that this is a paragraph feature. Remember what type of feature it is. Character or font, paragraph or page is a little bit different than what we're applying it to. In this case, we could be applying a paragraph feature to the entire document. All right, with that said, let's take a look at what we have. Here we're in our document, and we've been working kind of in these different paragraphs. And we're going to take a look at our second paragraph, which is this one that starts with "despite the recent economic downturn." And I'm just going to highlight that so it's a little bit easier to see on screen. When we want to change the line spacing, we can go ahead and do that. But I want you to take a look at what we have right now. This is actually the default that comes in the normal template. And it's not single line spacing. You'll see that it's a little bit wider than single line spacing. We can actually see what it is if we go to the Home tab, up to the paragraph group, and check out the line and paragraph spacing option. It's near the right-hand side of the paragraph group. When we give this a click, we can see that the default is actually 1.15 lines, a little bit bigger than just single spaced. If we pause over 1.0, continue to pause over some of these options, we'll see that because of live preview that we have in Office 2010, we can see what things like double spaced or even triple spaced would look like. And here it's very easy to see that what I was telling you is true. Line spacing is the amount of space between each line in the paragraph. We're going to go ahead and leave that at 1.15. And then we're going to talk about a different characteristic. This is actually the spacing before and after paragraphs. Again, if we look at our document, we can see that the end of the prior paragraph and the beginning of this one is not exactly one line. There's a little bit of extra space there. However, if we turn on our non-printing characters, we can see that there actually isn't an empty paragraph. In other words, they didn't do enter, enter to get this look. We go from one paragraph directly to the next. That's because there's extra spacing. The question is the spacing after the first paragraph or before the second paragraph? It could be either one, and by looking, we just can't tell that easily. Actually, we might be able to if we do some selection. Let's select the last line of the prior paragraph. Can you see how now we can see where the spacing is? This visually tells us that the spacing is at the end or after the prior paragraph. Once again, this is a default. And if we go up and take a look at the same drop-down for our line and paragraph spacing, we can see at the very bottom that there are two options. One says add a space before the paragraph, and the second one says remove a space after the paragraph. These actually are dynamic entries. What this is telling us, because it says add a space, is that currently there is not a space before the currently selected paragraph. However, we can also see kind of the opposite is true. Since it says remove a space after paragraph, that means that it does have that applied. So you don't see both add and remove for both. These just change depending on what the current setting is. If we click remove space after paragraph, you can see where this would become a problem. If we didn't have the line selected, and if we didn't have an indent here, it would be very difficult to tell where one paragraph ended and the next paragraph started. That's why this becomes so important. These days, we typically don't have indented paragraphs, unless of course you're following a format that requires that you do so. In other words, typically our paragraph alignment and our paragraph style is what we call flush left, something like this. Now it's almost impossible to tell where one paragraph stops and the other starts. If we use our paragraph spacing though, and in this case I'm going to go back up to that first paragraph, and I'm going to add the space back in. Now visually it's very easy to tell where they start and stop without having to do that extra enter or that extra blank paragraph in between. I think this is where we get into some of the critical differences in understanding that how things look on the page isn't necessarily how they're formatted on the page. When we start talking about hard returns versus soft returns, and now about line spacing versus hard returns, and paragraph spacing versus hard returns, we can see where this all becomes very important. We also can immediately see that this one tool, line spacing and paragraph spacing, makes a huge difference in the readability of our document. This may be one of the most important tools I think people should know about. As a matter of fact, it is one of the most important tools I think people should know about when it comes to formatting paragraphs, because as a graphic designer, an editor, a technical writer, and everything else that I've done in my career, I know that when people don't know about this, they do other things like the enter that makes editing or working with a document a real nightmare. Now we know the better way. As I often say, there isn't a right or wrong, but knowing how to use this particular tool is going to be the better way to work with documents, both now and as we work through the whole entire document creation and editing process.